It was an elegant Friday night in San Francisco when Steph Curry adjusted his tie knot and sighed discreetly. The grand Fairmont Hotel was filled with important people, golden lights reflecting in champagne glasses, and that sophisticated atmosphere he had learned to navigate over the years. But Steph didn't want to be there. The Warriors Foundation charity event was important. It raised millions for educational programs in the Bay Area. As the face of the franchise, his presence was not just expected, but essential. Still, while greeting donors and posing for photos, his mind was 30 minutes away, at home, where Ayesha was probably putting the children to bed. Have you ever felt torn between professional obligations and where your heart really wants to be? Steph knew this tension well, especially on nights like that one. The ballroom was decorated with impeccable elegance. Perfumed floral arrangements created a romantic atmosphere, while soft lighting transformed every conversation into something that seemed straight out of a movie. It was the kind of environment where connections were formed, business deals were closed, and sometimes other things happened. Steph circulated among the groups with the ease of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. He smiled genuinely, thanked fans for their support, and talked about basketball with the passion that characterized him. But any observant person would notice something. He checked his watch more frequently than would be necessary. It was impossible not to notice how Steph stood out there. Not just because of fame or height, but because of the aura of someone genuinely centered. While other men at the event seemed to be hunting, whether for business, networking, or other opportunities, Steph radiated a different energy. Contentment, purpose, fidelity, and it was exactly this energy that caught Jessica Chen's attention. Jessica was leaning against the bar, observing the ballroom with the calculating eyes of someone who knew exactly what she wanted and how to get it. At 32 years old, she had built an impressive career in public relations, working with high-level celebrities and athletes. She knew how the game worked. More importantly, she knew how to play. Naturally, this leads us to a fascinating question. What happens when someone accustomed to getting what they want meets someone truly unshakable in their principles? Jessica had noticed Steph the moment he entered the ballroom. It was hard not to notice. He commanded attention effortlessly, greeting people with that authenticity that most celebrities pretended to have. But there was something more that sparked her interest. He was clearly committed, happy in his marriage, and completely out of reach. And for Jessica, this wasn't an obstacle. It was a challenge. She observed Steph for almost an hour, studying his conversation patterns, noticing when he smiled genuinely versus when he was just being polite. Jessica had developed a particular skill over the years, identifying vulnerabilities in apparently unavailable men. Can you perceive how some people see commitment not as a boundary to be respected, but as a wall to be climbed? Jessica operated exactly in this way. He's being polite, but he's bored, she murmured to herself, taking a sip of her martini while continuing her observation. And bored men make interesting choices. What Jessica didn't understand, and what would become painfully clear soon, was that Steph wasn't bored with the people. He was simply anxious to go home. For him, events like that were work, not entertainment. But Jessica interpreted that energy completely differently. At 9:30 p.m., she decided it was time to act. Jessica approached the women's restroom mirror, touched up her lipstick, adjusted the neckline of the black dress she had strategically chosen, and practiced that smile that had opened doors throughout her career. It was a smile that said, "I'm interesting," without seeming desperate. "I'm confident," without seeming arrogant. It was a smile that worked. It always worked. When she left the restroom, Steph was talking with Robert Kim, one of the foundation's main donors. It was clearly a work conversation, serious expressions, discussion about numbers and social impact. The perfect moment for a casual interruption. Jessica approached slowly, timing her arrival for the natural end of the conversation. She had done this hundreds of times, appear at the right moment, as if by coincidence, creating an organic opportunity for interaction. "Steph Curry," she said with that tone that balanced genuine admiration with personal confidence. "I have to say, your foundation is doing incredible work. I'm Jessica Chen. I work in PR for several athletes." Steph turned, extending his hand with the natural politeness that characterized him. "Pleasure to meet you, Jessica. Thank you for supporting the cause." The handshake lasted a second longer than necessary. Jessica made sure of that. "I was observing how you interact with people," she continued, taking a step slightly closer. "You have this authenticity that's rare in this world. It must be tiring to always be on, isn't it?" It was a smart approach, not a direct compliment about appearance or athletic achievements, but something more psychological, a suggestion of deep understanding, of special connection. Steph smiled politely. "Actually, I enjoy meeting people who care about the same causes I do. It's energizing, not tiring." Diplomatic response, safe response. But Jessica heard what she wanted to hear. He hadn't closed the conversation immediately. Something that touches deeply is realizing how misunderstandings begin. Steph was being polite, fulfilling his professional role. Jessica was interpreting politeness as interest. "It's comforting to know that genuine people exist in this field," she said, lightly touching his arm while speaking. "I imagine you value authenticity in all areas of life." The word "all" was emphasized almost imperceptibly. But Steph noticed. It was at that moment that he understood exactly what was happening. Robert Kim had moved away to greet other guests, leaving Steph and Jessica alone near the bar. The ambient music created a bubble of intimacy, and the soft lighting made any conversation more suggestive. Jessica took advantage of the opportunity. "You know," she said, lowering her voice slightly and leaning closer, "events like this can be lonely, even surrounded by people. Sometimes it's nice to find someone who truly understands the pressure of always being in the spotlight." Steph felt the shift in the conversation's tone. He felt the intention behind the carefully chosen words. And for the first time that night, he became completely alert. What's most impressive is how moments of temptation arrive disguised as understanding and connection. Jessica wasn't being crude or obviously inappropriate. She was being skillful. But Steph had navigated these waters before, and he knew exactly where they led. "Jessica," he said, maintaining a respectful tone but creating subtle physical distance. "I appreciate the conversation, but I must say I'm anxious to get home. My wife is waiting, and we have a tradition of watching movies on Friday nights." It was a deliberate mention of his wife, a gentle but clear reminder about his status. Jessica smiled, not discouraged, but intrigued. "How sweet," she responded, "but the night is still young, and sometimes the best conversations happen when we step out of our comfort zone." And it was then that Steph realized that subtlety wasn't working. It was time to be brutally honest. And what he said next would shock not only Jessica, but everyone who was close enough to hear. But before that moment that would define everything, Jessica decided to intensify her strategy. She had interpreted the mention of his wife not as a limit, but as an obstacle to be circumvented with more skill. Traditions are beautiful, she said, taking an imperceptible step closer. But sometimes life surprises us with unexpected experiences that can be even more memorable. The way she said experiences carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. Steph felt the temperature of the conversation change, as if the air around them had become denser. Have you ever been in a situation where you realize exactly what someone is suggesting, but still hope you're wrong? Steph was having exactly that experience. Jessica noticed that she had captured his total attention. Not in the way she expected, but attention nonetheless. For her, any reaction was better than indifference. "You know, Steph," she continued, lowering her voice to an almost conspiratorial tone, "I work with many high-level athletes. I understand the unique pressures you face, the constant need to be perfect, to maintain an impeccable public image." It was a sophisticated, psychological approach. Jessica was suggesting that she understood aspects of his life that perhaps not even his wife completely understood. It must be exhausting to never be able to simply be human, without judgment, she added, touching his arm again, this time leaving her hand there for a few seconds longer. Steph looked at her hand on his arm, then at her eyes. There was something in his expression that Jessica couldn't immediately interpret. It wasn't interest, but it also wasn't obvious discomfort. It was analysis. Steph was processing not just what she was saying, but why she was saying it. "Jessica," he responded carefully, "I appreciate your perspective, but I must say I don't feel that pressure you mention. My public and private life are very aligned. I am the same man at home that I am here." Smart response. Steph was signaling integrity while maintaining a respectful tone. But Jessica heard this as an interesting challenge. How fascinating it is to realize how two people can have completely different conversations, even using the same words. Steph was establishing boundaries. Jessica was seeing opportunities to test them. "That's even more attractive," she said, smiling in a way that managed to be simultaneously admiring and suggestive. Authentic men are rare in this world. The word attractive was deliberate. Jessica had decided that too much subtlety wasn't working. It was time to be more direct, but still maintain plausible deniability. Steph felt the weight of that word. He felt how it had crossed the line between professional networking and something completely different. "Jessica," he began, but she interrupted him gently. "I know you're married," she said, as if she were reading his thoughts. "And I respect that. But sometimes special connections happen regardless of circumstances, don't they?" It was impossible not to notice how Jessica was constructing a narrative where what she proposed wasn't betrayal, but special connection, as if it were something above normal rules of morality. Steph remained silent for a moment, processing not just her words, but the complete context of the situation. They were in a relatively isolated corner of the ballroom. The music created a bubble of privacy, and the soft lighting made any conversation more intimate than it should be. To any casual observer, it might seem like two people having an intense conversation about business or social causes. But for Steph, it was clear that something completely different was happening. "Special connections," he repeated, as if testing the words. Interesting way to describe it. Jessica interpreted this as an opening to continue. "Look," she said, lowering her voice even more, and leaning in a way that anyone seeing from afar would assume they were sharing something confidential. "I know how the world works. I know that men in your position have opportunities, and I know that these opportunities can be discreet." The word discreet hung in the air between them like smoke. Naturally, this leads us to a deep reflection. How many men in similar positions had heard words exactly like these? Jessica had clearly used this approach before, and by the tone of confidence, it had probably worked. Steph realized this too. He realized that Jessica wasn't improvising. She was executing a well-developed strategy. "Jessica," he said, creating more physical space between them, "I think there's a misunderstanding here." But, instead of backing down, Jessica interpreted this as natural resistance that could be overcome. "There's no misunderstanding," she responded softly. "There are just possibilities. And sometimes, Steph, life's best experiences come from the possibilities we accept to explore." She paused, letting these words settle, then added something that made her intentions absolutely unequivocal. "My hotel room is on the 22nd floor, room 2247. Sometimes I leave parties early, when I find more interesting conversations." The silence that followed was charged with tension. Jessica had just made an explicit invitation, disguised as a casual suggestion. Can you perceive how moments like this truly test a person's character? Not when it's easy to make the right choice, but when temptation is presented skillfully, attractively, and apparently without consequences. Steph looked at Jessica, really looked, perhaps for the first time in the conversation. He saw an attractive, intelligent woman who clearly knew how to navigate complex situations. In other circumstances, with another man, this approach would probably have worked. But Steph Curry wasn't another man. "Jessica," he said, and there was something in his tone of voice that made her stop smiling for the first time in the conversation. What's most impressive is how Jessica finally realized she had miscalculated. Steph's silence wasn't consideration about the proposal. It was disappointment with the entire situation. "I need to be completely clear with you," Steph continued, "because I think you deserve total honesty, even if it's uncomfortable." Jessica felt something change in the atmosphere around them. The confidence she had carried throughout the conversation began to waver. "Steph, I didn't mean to." "No," he interrupted her gently, but firmly. "Let me speak. Because what I'm going to say now is important not just for you, but for anyone who might be listening." And it was at that moment that Jessica realized that other people really were listening. Amanda Foster, a sports journalist, had approached to greet Steph. Tyler Brooks, a young entrepreneur, was waiting to talk about a possible partnership. Marcus Williams, from the Warriors marketing department, was observing from a distance. What began as a private conversation was about to become a public statement, and Steph Curry was about to be more brutally honest than any of them expected. Great moments of truth rarely happen in private, and Steph was about to prove exactly that. Steph took a deep breath, looked directly into Jessica's eyes, and did something that she, and everyone around, would never expect. He chose brutal honesty over polite diplomacy. "Jessica," he began, with a calm that contrasted with the tension of the moment, "I'm going to be completely frank with you, because I think you, and anyone who might be listening to this, deserve to understand something fundamental about who I am." His tone of voice made nearby conversations decrease in volume. Amanda Foster stopped checking her phone. Tyler Brooks mentally canceled any rush he had. Marcus Williams approached discreetly. It was impossible not to notice that something important was about to happen. "You mentioned that you work with many athletes," Steph continued, maintaining a respectful but absolutely firm tone. "And you suggested that I, like them, would have opportunities that could be discreet." I want you to understand why that suggestion not only failed with me, but why it represents a view of masculinity that I completely reject. Jessica felt the ground move under her feet. This wasn't going in the direction she expected. Not at all. Steph, I wasn't suggesting. You were suggesting exactly what I think you were, he interrupted her gently. And that's okay. You're not the first person to make this suggestion, and you probably won't be the last. But I want to use this moment to explain something that few people understand about true commitment. Have you ever witnessed that rare moment where someone transforms an embarrassing situation into a life lesson? Steph was doing exactly that, and everyone around could feel the power of that moment. I choose my wife every day, Steph said, and there was a conviction in his voice that made the entire environment quieter. Not out of obligation, not out of fear of consequences, not because I don't have other options. I choose her because it's who I am at my deepest core. Amanda Foster completely stopped pretending she wasn't listening. Tyler Brooks canceled any pretense of being there by coincidence. Even Marcus Williams, who had seen Steph handle delicate situations before, was fascinated by the raw honesty of that moment. Jessica, you're right about one thing, Steph continued. Men in my position receive this type of proposal frequently, and many accept, creating a culture where infidelity is seen as a privilege of success, as if fame gave the right to break sacred promises. The word sacred echoed in the air like a bell. Naturally, this leads us to a question that few men can answer honestly. What really defines our integrity when no one is watching? Steph was answering this question publicly, and the answer was shocking everyone present. But here's what you don't understand, Steph said, taking a slight step back, creating more physical space between them. I'm not faithful to my wife because I'm a good boy, or because I'm afraid of getting caught. I'm faithful because fidelity is the outward expression of the man I've chosen to be inwardly. Jessica was visibly uncomfortable now, not just because she was being rejected, but because she was being educated about why she was being rejected in front of other people. When I said my marriage vows, Steph continued, I wasn't just promising not to betray my wife. I was promising to be the kind of man who doesn't even consider betrayal as an option. There's a huge difference between these two things. What's most impressive is how Steph was transforming a moment of temptation into a masterclass on male character, without sounding pretentious or judgmental. Jessica, you mentioned that I must get tired of always having to be perfect in public, he said. But the truth is, there's no difference between who I am in public and who I am in private. That's the definition of integrity, being the same person when no one is watching. Tyler Brooks would later describe this moment as watching someone define masculinity in real time. Amanda Foster would say it was the most powerful demonstration of moral leadership I've ever witnessed. Marcus Williams would simply say it was typical of Steph, turning any situation into something uplifting. You suggested that your room would be available for more interesting conversations, Steph continued, maintaining a respectful tone even while addressing the explicit invitation. I want you to understand why that's not a conversation I would ever have, with you or with anyone else who wasn't my wife. Jessica was clearly struggling between the impulse to leave immediately and the morbid fascination of hearing where this was going. It's not because you're not attractive, Steph said. It's not because I don't understand what you're offering. It's because I have a very clear understanding of who I am and what I represent. Something that touches deeply is realizing how Steph was being brutally honest without being cruel. He was rejecting the proposal in a way that, in a sense, honored Jessica's dignity while keeping his own integrity intact. I represent something to millions of young people who see me as an example, Steph continued. But more important than that, I represent something to my wife and children. I am the standard of masculinity that my daughters will use to evaluate future partners. I am the example of fidelity that my sons will follow in their own marriages. The depth of this responsibility hit everyone present like a wave. True men make choices based on who they want to be, not on what they can get away with, Steph said, and this phrase would go viral on social media in the coming weeks. And I choose to be a man who honors his commitments, even when no one would find out if I didn't honor them. Jessica finally found her voice. Steph, I didn't mean to offend you. You didn't offend me, Steph responded immediately. You gave me an opportunity to clarify who I am. And for that, I thank you. How fascinating it is how Steph was transforming even gratitude into a character lesson. He was showing that truly secure men don't need to take offense when tested. They use these tests as opportunities to demonstrate their values. Jessica, I hope you find someone who deserves your attention and can reciprocate it honestly and with integrity, Steph said. But that someone is not me and could never be. Not for lack of opportunity, but for abundance of purpose. And then Steph said something that would leave everyone speechless. I'm going to tell my wife this entire conversation when I get home tonight. Not because I'm obligated to, but because total transparency is how real relationships work. She'll laugh, she'll kiss me, and she'll thank me for being the man she married. The silence that followed was deafening. Jessica was processing not just the rejection, but the fact that Steph had just demonstrated a level of marital transparency that she didn't even know existed. Amanda, Tyler, and Marcus were absorbing what they had just witnessed, a live demonstration of male integrity that was as rare as it was powerful. And then Steph did something no one expected. He smiled. Not a condescending or superior smile, but a genuine smile of someone completely at peace with their choices. Jessica, it was a pleasure talking with you. I hope you enjoy the rest of the party. And with that, he turned to talk with Amanda about the Foundation's journalistic coverage, as if the last 10 minutes had been a perfectly normal conversation about networking. But everyone knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary, and the reaction that followed would be even more surprising. What happened in the moments following Steph's declaration was something none of those present would ever forget. Jessica Chen, a woman accustomed to controlling situations and people, was completely speechless for the first time in years. It wasn't just embarrassment, it was something deeper, a kind of existential shock at realizing she had encountered someone operating with a moral code she didn't even know still existed. I need to go to the restroom, Jessica murmured, clearly needing a moment to process what had just happened. She moved away quickly, but not before everyone noticed the blush taking over her face. It was impossible not to notice how Jessica's shock was different from simple rejection. She had been educated about the difference between a man who is faithful by convenience and a man who is faithful by conviction. Amanda Foster was the first to break the silence that followed. Steph, she said, with genuine admiration in her voice, in 15 years covering sports, I've never seen anything like what I just witnessed. What do you mean? Steph asked, genuinely curious. You just transformed what could have been a scandal into a lesson about character, Amanda responded. Most athletes would have handled this completely differently. Tyler Brooks, who had planned a quick conversation about business, approached with an expression of respect he couldn't hide. Man, he said, I came here thinking about talking about a possible commercial partnership. But after what I just heard, I want to do business with you just because I admire the kind of man you are. Can you perceive how genuine authenticity attracts people magnetically? Steph wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply being who he was. And that was causing a much greater impact than any marketing strategy could achieve. Marcus Williams approached the group, shaking his head with a mixture of admiration and amusement. "Steph," he said, "in all the years working with you, I thought I had seen everything. But this, man, this is going to become legend." "Why are you all acting like I did something extraordinary?" Steph asked. "I just was honest about my values." And it was exactly this question that revealed why everyone was so shocked. Naturally, this leads us to a disturbing reflection. Do we live in a world where male fidelity has become so rare that when someone demonstrates it publicly, they're treated as a hero? Amanda articulated exactly that. "Steph, you're right. You just were honest about your values. But the sad reality is that this honesty is extraordinary nowadays, especially coming from someone in your position." "Most famous men I know," Tyler added, "would have at least considered her proposal, or would have rejected it in a way that left the door open for the future. You didn't just close the door, you explained why it never existed." What's most impressive is how Steph was discovering that his normality was exceptional to others. For him, fidelity was just part of who he was. For the people around him, it was being a revelation about what was possible. Marcus observed something interesting. "Steph, did you notice that at least 20 people stopped talking to listen to you?" People literally abandoned their own conversations because they felt something important was happening. It was true. The corner of the ballroom where they were had become the focal point of discreet attention. People pretended to be talking about other things, but kept their ears attentive to catch any continuation of that extraordinary conversation. "And the most incredible thing," Amanda continued, "is that you were brutally honest without being brutal. You rejected her proposal in a way that, strangely, honored her dignity. At the same time, you maintained your own." Steph smiled. "Cruelty is never necessary when you have clarity about your values." This phrase would echo among those present for weeks. Tyler made an insightful observation. "You know what impressed me most? You mentioned that you're going to tell your wife everything about this. That's not just fidelity, it's total transparency. How many marriages function at this level of honesty?" "All marriages should function this way," Steph responded simply. And it was at that moment that everyone understood why they were so shocked. It wasn't just about Steph being faithful. It was about him demonstrating a relationship standard that raised the bar for all the men present. Amanda was making mental notes for an article. "Steph, may I ask, where does this clarity about values come from? Is this something you developed over time, or was it always like this?" "My mother always told me that character is who you are when no one is watching," Steph responded. "But I would add, character is also who you choose to be when everyone is watching and expecting you to compromise your values." Marcus laughed. "Man, you just gave a definition of integrity that should be in philosophy books." At that moment, they noticed that Jessica was returning from the restroom, clearly having used the time to compose herself. She approached the group with a very different expression than she had before. "Steph," she said, interrupting the conversation, "I'd like to speak with you for a moment." Everyone became tense, not knowing what to expect. Jessica took a deep breath. "I want to apologize. not just for making that inappropriate proposal, but for assuming you would be like other men I've met in this field. Have you ever witnessed that rare moment where someone has enough humility to recognize when they were fundamentally wrong? Jessica was having exactly that moment. "You don't need to apologize," Steph said gently, "but I appreciate your words." "Actually, I do need to," Jessica insisted, "because I realize now that I was operating with a very cynical view about successful men. You showed me that this view was wrong, at least in your case." Amanda, Tyler, and Marcus observed this interaction with fascination. It was like watching a transformation in real time. "Jessica," Steph said, "we all make assumptions sometimes. What's important is being willing to adjust those assumptions when we find contrary evidence." "May I ask a question?" Jessica said hesitantly. "Of course. How did you develop this conviction, this clarity about who you are?" Steph thought for a moment. "I think it comes from understanding that our character isn't tested when it's easy to do the right thing. It's tested exactly in moments like this, when doing the right thing has a cost, even if it's just the discomfort of a difficult conversation." And then he added, "Something that would leave everyone reflective for the rest of the night. Jessica, you offered me something that many men would consider tempting. But I already have everything I want. I have a wife who loves me, children who respect me, and the peace that comes from knowing I'm the same person in private that I am in public. What could you offer that would surpass that?" The silence that followed was different from previous silences. It wasn't discomfort. It was deep contemplation. True men make choices based on who they want to be, not on what they can get. And Steph had just demonstrated exactly that in a way that touched everyone present's heart. But the impact of that night was just beginning to spread. In the following 2 hours, something extraordinary happened at the charity event. The story of what had occurred between Steph and Jessica spread through the ballroom like concentric waves, but not in the way one might expect. It wasn't malicious gossip or speculation about a scandal avoided. It was something much rarer. People sharing a story about integrity witnessed firsthand. Tyler Brooks was the first to begin this inadvertent movement. During a conversation with other young entrepreneurs present, he couldn't avoid mentioning what he had witnessed. "Man," he said to Connor Smith, CEO of a technology startup, "I just saw Steph Curry redefine what it means to be a man in real time." "How so?" Connor asked, intrigued. "Have you ever noticed how stories about genuine characters spread differently from common gossip? They carry a weight, a gravity that makes people stop to really listen." Tyler told the story with the respect of someone who had witnessed something sacred. He didn't mention unnecessary names or embarrassing details, but focused on Steph's response, on the clarity of his values, on how he had transformed temptation into teaching. Connor was silent for a long moment after hearing. "Wait," he said finally. "He really said he was going to tell his wife everything when he got home?" "Word for word," Tyler confirmed, "and he said it as if it were the most natural thing in the world." That's a level of marital transparency I didn't even know existed," Connor admitted, clearly reflecting on his own relationship. It was impossible not to notice how the story was provoking self-reflection in everyone who heard it. It wasn't just about admiring Steph, but about questioning their own standards of integrity. Naturally, this leads us to a powerful question. How often do we encounter such clear examples of character that force us to reevaluate our own choices? Meanwhile, on the other side of the ballroom, Amanda Foster was having a similar conversation with Nicole Martinez, a television producer, and Lauren Miller, a lawyer specializing in women's rights. "Amanda, "Were you there when this happened?" Nicole asked, after hearing a summary of the situation. "Not only was I there," Amanda responded, "I saw a man transform what could have been an embarrassing moment for everyone into a masterclass on male integrity." Lauren made an interesting observation. "What impresses me most isn't just that he rejected the advance. It's that he did it in a way that, strangely, educated the woman about why she was being rejected. That requires a rare level of emotional maturity." "Exactly," Amanda agreed. "He could have been condescending or rude or simply left the situation. Instead, he used the moment to articulate a complete life philosophy." Nicole was making mental notes. "This would be an incredible segment for my show. Not the attempted seduction part, but his response. How men can be firm in their values without being cruel." What's most impressive is how the story was inspiring conversations about much deeper themes than the original incident. It was provoking discussions about healthy masculinity, marital transparency, moral leadership. In another corner of the ballroom, Marcus Williams was talking with Daniel Patel, marketing director for a large corporation, and Christopher Lee, a relationship psychologist who was present as a guest. "Marcus, you've known Steph for years," Daniel said. "Is this typical of him?" "The brutal honesty? Completely typical," Marcus responded. "But articulating his life philosophy this way, in front of strangers, this was something special, even by his standards." Dr. Christopher Lee made a professional observation. "From a psychological standpoint, what Steph demonstrated is extremely rare. He showed what we call integrated integrity, when your public and private values don't just align, but mutually reinforce each other." "Explain that better," Daniel asked. "Most people have multiple versions of themselves," Dr. Lee explained. "The public version, the private version, the version they show to different groups. Steph demonstrated that he's fundamentally the same person in all these contexts. That's psychologically very healthy and ethically very powerful." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "That's why working with him is so easy. There are no unpleasant surprises, because he's exactly who he appears to be." Can you perceive how the story was being analyzed from multiple perspectives? Business, psychological, ethical, and all were reaching the same conclusion about the rarity of what they had witnessed. But perhaps the most significant conversation was happening between two married men who had heard the story through third parties. Alex Rodriguez, a 38-year-old businessman, was talking with Ryan Johnson, a 42-year-old lawyer, near the bar. "Ryan," Alex said, lowering his voice, "that Steph Curry story made me think about some uncomfortable things about myself." "How so?" Ryan asked. "I've never cheated on my wife," Alex said carefully. "But I've also never articulated to myself why I wouldn't cheat. It's more out of convenience and fear of consequences than deep conviction." Ryan fell silent, clearly processing Alex's brutal honesty. "And honestly," Alex continued, "the idea of having total transparency with my wife, telling her about every temptation or inappropriate proposal I receive, that scares me. Because it would mean admitting that these things happen." "Man," Ryan said finally, "you just articulated something I didn't have the courage to admit. I always thought protecting my wife from knowing about these situations was kindness, but maybe it's cowardice." It was impossible not to notice how Steph's story was provoking conversations about the foundations of relationships that these people had avoided having with themselves for years. Something that touches deeply is realizing how an example of integrity can function as a mirror, reflecting aspects of our own character that we preferred not to examine. "Alex," Ryan said, "how about we make a pact? let's try to be more honest with our wives about, well, about everything. Not because we're obligated to, but because maybe total transparency is what real relationships deserve. Alex extended his hand. Deal. But man, this is going to be uncomfortable. The best changes usually are, Ryan responded, shaking his friend's hand. Meanwhile, Jessica Chen had left the event early, but not before having a final conversation with Amanda Foster. Amanda, she said, can you do me a favor? Sure. If you write about this, and I hope you do, can you focus on the example Steph gave, not on the mistake I made? I learned something important tonight, and I'd like other men and women to be able to learn, too. Amanda smiled. Jessica, that shows a lot of class on your part. Steph taught me that character is how we react when confronted with our own imperfection, Jessica said. I'm trying to react with growth, not defensiveness. And it was at that moment that Amanda realized the story wasn't just about Steph's integrity, but about the transformative power of respectful honesty. True leaders make a difference, not just by the choices they make, but by how their choices inspire others to raise their own standards. And the legacy of that night was just beginning to take shape. 3 weeks after the charity event, Amanda Foster published an article that would go viral within hours. The title was simple: What Steph Curry Taught Me About True Masculinity. The article didn't mention specific names besides Steph's, respecting everyone involved's privacy, but it perfectly captured the essence of what had happened that night and, more importantly, the lasting impact that continued to spread. We rarely witness moments that redefine our understanding of character, Amanda wrote. But on a Friday night in San Francisco, I saw a man transform what could have been a scandal into a lesson about integrity that still inspires me weeks later. What's most impressive is how the article captured not just the event itself, but the transformation it had provoked in everyone present. Amanda had interviewed several people who were there, and the pattern was consistent. Everyone had left that event rethinking their own standards of integrity. Within 48 hours, the article had been shared more than 100,000 times. But what really surprised was the nature of the comments. They weren't just empty praise for Steph, but deep reflections from readers about their own relationships and values. One comment in particular caught attention. This article made me realize I was confusing being faithful with being integral. Steph Curry showed that there's a huge difference between not cheating because it's convenient and not cheating because it's who you are at your core. Can you perceive how a genuine example of character creates waves that expand far beyond the original moment? What Steph had done in 10 minutes was influencing conversations and decisions in relationships around the world. Tyler Brooks, inspired by Steph's example, had implemented a new policy in his company: radical transparency at all leadership levels. If it works in marriages, he told his team, it can work in business too. Connor Smith had started more honest conversations with his wife about professional pressures and temptations he faced in the corporate world. Not because I have to, he explained to a friend, but because transparency is a gift I can give to my marriage. Alex Rodriguez and Ryan Johnson had kept the pact they made that night. Both reported that their marriages had strengthened significantly with the increased level of honesty. It's uncomfortable sometimes, Alex admitted, but it's the kind of discomfort that builds trust. Naturally, this leads us to a powerful reflection. How many positive changes can be triggered by a single example of unquestionable integrity? Dr. Christopher Lee had incorporated the story, without identifying specific people, into his couples therapy sessions. I use this as an example of how clear communication about values can transform potentially destructive situations into constructive moments, he explained to patients. But perhaps the most significant impact happened in an unexpected place. Jessica Chen had spent weeks reflecting on that night, not just about the initial embarrassment, but about the deeper lesson Steph had taught her, that rejection based on principles was, actually, more respectful than acceptance based on opportunism. She sought out Amanda for a follow-up conversation. "Amanda," Jessica said, "I want you to know that night fundamentally changed how I see relationships and integrity." "How so?" Amanda asked. "I always operated from the premise that all men were negotiable if you found the right price, whether attention, opportunity, or ego," Jessica explained. "Steph showed me that there's a category of people who simply aren't for sale." Something that touches deeply is realizing how Jessica had transformed a moment of humiliation into genuine personal growth. "And more than that," she continued, "he showed me that I want to be with someone from that category. Not someone who chooses me because I'm the best available option, but someone who chooses me because I'm compatible with who he is at his core." "That's very profound, Jessica." "Steph said something that night that hasn't left my mind," Jessica reflected. "He already had everything he wanted. He didn't say it arrogantly, but as a statement of fact. I want to build a life where I can also say that, honestly." 6 months later, Jessica was in a relationship with someone she met through volunteering, not networking or professional events, but serving food at a homeless shelter. "I met someone based on shared values," she told Amanda, "not mutual opportunity." Amanda's article had inspired other journalists to explore similar themes. A series of articles about authentic masculinity began appearing in various publications, all using principles similar to those Steph had demonstrated. One of these articles included a quote that became widely shared. "True men don't prove their masculinity by conquering women. They prove it by honoring the woman they've already conquered." It was impossible not to notice how a moment of honesty had created a broader cultural conversation about what it means to be an integral man in the 21st century. Marcus Williams observed the phenomenon with admiration. "Steph," he said during a marketing meeting, "do you realize that night at the charity event created more positive impact for your brand than any advertising campaign we've ever done?" "How so?" Steph asked. "People aren't just admiring you," Marcus explained. "They're trying to be more like you. That's real influence, when your example changes other people's behavior for the better." Steph smiled. "Marcus, I wasn't trying to influence anyone. I was just being who I am." "And that's exactly why it worked," Marcus responded. 2 years later, Amanda received dozens of letters from readers telling how the article had impacted their relationships. Couples reported greater transparency. Men talked about redefining their understanding of fidelity. Women described raising their standards for romantic partners. One couple even named their son Steph in honor of the example they had read in the article. But perhaps the most powerful legacy was the simplest. In a world where integrity sometimes seems antiquated, Steph Curry had proven that genuine character not only still exists, but still has the power to transform lives. True leaders make a difference, not by the words they say, but by the examples they live. And sometimes, a single moment of brutal honesty can inspire an entire generation to raise their own standards. What really shocked that night wasn't the rejection of a temptation, but the discovery that men with genuine convictions still exist, and that when they act with integrity, the whole world pays attention. Because in the end, it wasn't about what Steph said that shocked everyone. It was about who he showed himself to be, and that more than any word, is what changes the world.